Hello, and if you missed class, you were unable to see part of the New Deal notes, so I want you to take a little bit of time, use the fill-in-the-blank notes that I provided all students, make sure you jot down some of this information. Maybe you do already have this written down, and you just want to review some of the things we've talked about in class. Either way, thank you very much for watching this video. Let's talk about the beginning of the New Deal. Now, remember, as you can see in the bottom left of the screen, all the blue states voted for Roosevelt. All the red states voted for Hoover. They had pretty much abandoned Herbert Hoover and his way of government reform. Unlike any other leader, Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw government as a solution, not a danger to business, but a solution to the Great Depression. And he believed that it was a responsibility of government to protect the economy and help it grow. So, he came up with a series of proposals. There was no definitive plan. I can't point to something and say he expected within 24 months that such and such would work. But he did believe in radical change to government and business. Now, we call all of his programs and proposals, we call it the New Deal. And it is the program that ended the Great Depression, and it was also designed to prevent a new one. Now, think about when he was elected. I'm going to play you a little clip of his campaign song during the 1932 year. And you get a basic taste of what I'm talking about when I say he's got a very different approach. It's the idea of happy days are here again. This is 1933, 32, that era, where the Great Depression is at its worst. So clearly he's trying to present a more positive and affirmative type of government approach to the Great Depression. Now, when you look at how government has changed, before the New Deal, so we're going to say 1932 on back, government was only 12% of our entire national income. That was a small portion of the entire pie. The New Deal is going to double that. We go from 12% to 24% by 1940. That ain't nothing. That is continued. Take a look at the modern day. 43% of our entire national income, 43% comes from the government. So the New Deal and FDR have a huge impact not only in how the national government relates to American citizens, but how we view the role of any government. Now, when he became president, the first big issue, the crisis really, is the national banks and the fact that the national banks were closing. Between 1932 and 33, 4,000 banks had shuttered. FDR is immediately going to turn to the medium of radio, and he's going to broadcast what are called fireside chats. Americans at the time, there is no TV, there is no internet, so everyone would get together near the radio and they'd listen to the news or they'd listen to speeches. FDR used these fireside chats to kind of rally Americans around the idea of protecting banks, of allowing government to do more. A lot of this happens in the first 100 days. And the 100 days, in fact, it's how we measure our presidents now. But it's a special session of Congress that is going to pass a massive new government spending and new government programs. And it's got a lot of support behind it because of the fireside chat. So let's look at the banks, for example. As you can see, 1933, 1934, 4,000 banks are closing. It looks like the economy is shot. A lot of that is because over on the bottom right, the Wall Street panic had resulted in the stock market crash. Banks had loaned money out to the investors. They're not going to get their money back. This political cartoon came out. You've got a squirrel, an animal that's known for saving up for winter. And the squirrel is talking to this man who's fallen on hard times. And the squirrel says, "But why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good?" And the man sitting there forlorn and destitute is just saying, "I did." He's a victim of bank failure, and that's the fear of the Great Depression. That's what really terrified people. The idea that you can do everything right and still fail. It is something so overwhelming to Americans, they cannot believe such an event could occur. So Roosevelt steps in. He closes the banks for 4 days, puts millions of dollars into the banks, gives his speech. It reinvigorates Americans' faith in the banking system, saves it immediately. And that's part of what we call the New Deal. Now, the New Deal and we're not going to have time for this. The New Deal comes in three parts: relief, recovery, and reform. Stopping the Great Depression from getting worse. Recovering, getting our economy back the way it should. Making sure a Great Depression never happens again. Let's look at the first part. Now, the relief part is where, move that out of the way, it's where the government will take immediate action to stop the economy from getting worse. So some of the programs that we think of is the Civilian Conservation Corps, temporary jobs for young men, a banking holiday, new laws that restrict and actually separate commercial banks from investment banks, so that stuff that happened in the Great Depression with bank collapse resulting from a stock market collapse can't happen again. And of course, the use of propaganda to get people to feel more comfortable about government being involved in the economy. The second part is now let's rebuild our economy. These are programs that are supposed to restart the flow of consumer spending. In 2020 and 2021, the government spent trillions sending money to Americans, American families. Most of you received it. Hundreds, thousands of dollars in many cases. And it was expected they would continue to spend. If they spend, those institutions and businesses that are still open would continue. Well, that's what the government's trying to do. So the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, is trying to provide jobs for building. They built schools, other public works projects. You think of the old Billinghurst Middle School, the Stampede and Frenchman's Lake. Those are programs that are more long-term business. Farming regulations come out. The farming industry becomes under greater control of the government. Farmers are willing to go along with it because they are desperate. Now, when businesses start seeing the government try to regulate their prices, their hours, how they're going to organize, businesses tend to push back, and this is one of the few failures of the New Deal. The third aspect is reform. Let's make sure this never happens again. Another depression is unacceptable. Well, in the Tennessee Valley area, so we're talking Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, you tend to think of a pretty impoverished area. About 20-25% of people in that area have electricity. So almost 80% of the residents of that area are still living like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. You are going to see flooding stop being a regional issue with the building of dams, but those dams are hydroelectric dams so that they can use electricity, create electricity, expand economic opportunities. And speaking of economic opportunities, the Social Security Administration, this is government-run retirement. Most of you will receive this, say, at 67 or 73 years old is when most of you will get it. Sorry to depress you, you're about 53 years more of work before you can get that. But the idea is to get the elderly out of the economy, get them out of the workplace so you can hire younger workers. And then protecting unions, protecting those worker organizations. Now, there are some challenges to the New Deal because a lot of people see this as unconstitutional and that this is a violation of checks and balances. In 7th grade, we talked about how each branch has controls over the other. And not only would one branch now have enormous power, but the government would become larger and more powerful than the state governs or the individuals. The Supreme Court steps in and starts striking down laws like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the NRA, the National Recovery Act, and you begin to see these New Deal programs go down. Well, the result is Roosevelt's going to fight back. Now, these are the 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and so Roosevelt comes up with this idea, why don't I put more judges on the court? I'll appoint them so they'll support me. And that would increase the judges from 9 to 15. I'll now have control over the court. Obviously, adding more justices to the Supreme Court is going to upset a lot of people because it screws with that checks and balances system. Congress won't go along with it. Many Americans see this as just too much power being taken by the president. The Supreme Court, however, got the message. They stopped opposing the New Deal programs. So at the end, the court packing scandal actually wasn't needed. Now, some of the effects of the New Deal. Now, we know Nevada had no real infrastructure. We're talking roads, trails, reservoirs, the dams. It had none of that. This is a pretty backward state in 1930s America. So Roosevelt is going to actually spend more money in Nevada per person, per capita, than any other state, building new highways, public parks, trails. The big one in the bottom left is Hoover Dam. It's near Las Vegas. Hoover Dam would create a lake behind it, and it would also provide electricity for what would later become Las Vegas, that glittering Sin City that we think of today. So, Roosevelt is seen as necessary to the economy. He's the only man to be elected 4 times president. In fact, we have a constitutional amendment preventing someone from running again for that long. 2 full terms is the limit. Labor movement and unions were finally supported by the government. For the first time, we begin to see and hear about worker rights and the protections of worker rights. But the role of government has changed. It's no longer a passive part of the economy. It's helping to control it, and we see that today. And the federal government now has the power to become a superpower. And when we get to World War II, which unfortunately is less than a decade away from this period, we're going to see that power put to the test. If you have questions, please stop by class. I'd love to be able to answer them. I can give you some resources if you're interested in some of this stuff. And of course, we're going to talk about how the Great Depression and the New Deal reforms are going to then sort of shift into high gear during World War II, where we'll see the government even more involved. Otherwise, have a great week.